Hello, Jolly Franchers, Jolly here. I know what I said in the title, and it's true, in a way, but against all good advice, I think you should make narrative-driven games. They are just better. And here's why. When I was a kid, my mom would always read to me before bed. I was extremely fortunate to have a theater major for a mother. As a 7-year-old, I remember complimenting how good her character voices were, and 7-year-olds are usually truthful to a fault, so you know she must be that good. Her storytelling abilities have inspired me to do pretty much everything I've ever done. Go to acting school, start a role-playing podcast with my brother, or start making a murder mystery video game called Kid Detective. Please wishlist it on Steam. Link in the description. Love you. She inspired me to love stories and storytelling, something that is fundamentally human. Unfortunately, she also inspired me to never read a book again, because if she's not reading it, what's the point? Stories are, in whatever type they come in, a form of communication, and when written correctly, thoroughly, and thoughtfully, they're one of the best forms of communication we have. The point of all of this is people engage in stories on their own. No gameplay is required for you to watch Game of Thrones. No gameplay or images are required for you to listen to the Adventure Zone podcast. No gameplay is required to talk to a loved one and hear their comedic foibles about their grocery store trip. So, if storytelling is this powerful a tool, why do video games focus on narrative, on writing, and on storytelling so little? It's no secret that video game writing is generally poor. Doom, despite being super fun, is not known for its nuanced storytelling. Minecraft, Tetris, and Wii Sports are 3 of the highest selling video games in history, and they don't even have writing, a story, maybe a little. It's hard to have an immersive story when you have to break the action to tell the player, press the A button to jump, or that every NPC has to wait around for the player to do something because, well, they're the player. It's not the fault of every first-person shooter, side-scroller, or any video game that focuses on combat that by the end of the game, your kill count is somewhere in the thousands, making you the world's most prolific serial killer. It's hard to fault them for not mentioning that when you're supposed to be the hero. So they just don't acknowledge the fact that you're the world's most talented murderer. And the truth is, I don't fault them for that. You see, story writing in video games is incredibly difficult. What would Pokemon be if we acknowledged its resemblance to dogfighting? Well, it wouldn't be much fun, but it would make more narrative sense. The world would seem more real. Nobody wants that. On top of the expenses and difficulties with localizing or translating the game into a different language, hiring a writer, or as AAA studios do, multiple writers, making video games centers around programmers. Without programmers, you could write the most incredible video game story and no one would be able to see it. Mario wouldn't be able to jump. You couldn't click through the dialogue, the voiceover wouldn't get synced up, and well, you wouldn't have any gameplay. There would be no game. Stories are easy to tell. They can be told in any medium. Don't make a video game, it's too hard. Just go make a podcast instead. On top of all of this, one of the main challenges in video game writing goes against one of the main principles of clean coding. Never repeat yourself. Or don't write the same line of code twice, or basically, don't double your work. Every cutscene, every line of dialogue in a video game is a unique event. You have to double your work every time you write a new line of dialogue or put in a voiceover. Aside from barks during combat or more complicated procedural dialogue, which rarely, but not never, yields natural results. However, enemies, weapons, items, save points, upgrades, well, those all share similarities within their category. They aren't entirely unique from one another. You don't have to double or triple your work to make a new upgrade if you already have an upgrade system. Let's take cars, for example. If we look at a car, say from Cyberpunk 2077, a good programmer would have created a piece of code called a class that dictates the basic behavior for all cars. You can't walk through them, they can only drive forwards and backwards, is it four-wheel drive, etc. That way, you don't have to write a new script for each individual car. You don't repeat yourself. Not only does this prevent you from doubling your work, it limits your chances of typos or unexplainable bugs caused by one rogue car that explodes at random, and also limits your need to type the same couple lines of code 1,000 times for each car in the game, because that one car exploding at random can actually crash your entire game or cause more sinister, unexplainable problems. The more you repeat yourself or double or triple the amount of code you have to write, the more code you have to comb through to figure out what is crashing your game. And this is one of the biggest challenges for text-based games. Every cutscene should be unique. If it's not, well, it's annoying. You want to click through it as fast as you can. Aside from a couple of exceptions, every line of dialogue should be unique. The camera has to face the character when they're speaking, their mouth has to move when they're talking, and the emotion of the character has to change, which is not easy for a computer or a line of code to procedurally determine. But without repetition, the work is incredibly daunting. My best example of this comes from working on my detective game, Kid Detective. Similar to the Ace Attorney series, after investigating a crime, you have to prove your case in court. In court, you have to find contradictions in witness testimony. If you find a lie in any piece of their testimony, you can contradict them with a piece of evidence that proves them wrong. For instance, in this case, Peachy here insists that I can't prove anyone was in the victim's room at 12 a.m. But I have video evidence that shows that a shadowy figure entered the victim's room at 12 a.m. If I submit that evidence, there's unique dialogue that moves us closer to convicting our chosen suspect. The problem emerges, however, when you realize that I could have submitted any of 32 unique pieces of evidence to try to prove Peachy wrong. And since he has 4 different statements that I could try to contradict, that yields 4 times 32, or 128 different unique options that the player could choose. And 128 small bits of dialogue to write. No, that would be stupid. That wouldn't just double my work, it would 128ify my work. I should just give the same generic cutscene to each wrong choice. The player character, KD, will just say, "What about this evidence, huh?" And the judge will say, "Nah, that doesn't make any sense." That way, the player will know that they were wrong, and I won't have to repeat myself or 128ify my work, and I'll be a good coder, and that will make the game better, right? My first beta testers all came back with the same frustration. I submitted a piece of evidence that should have showed how sweet the suspect is, that she doesn't have any motive whatsoever. But all I got was, nah, that doesn't make any sense. The player wasn't getting any feedback, even though I created a neat coding solution. Naturally, because I love games that account for every possibility for player expression, and because I'm a perfectionist, I set to work over the course of 3 8-hour work periods, making unique dialogue feedback, unique hints for all 48 testimonies in the game and all 32 clues. 48 times 32 equals 1,536 unique cutscenes. Now, it wasn't as bad as it sounds. I found an acceptable way to cut down that number by grouping evidence into categories. I did a lot of copy-pasting, and they all follow the same general pattern. But after I was done, I was proud, and I said, I'm glad I never have to do that again. And that's when, 2 days later, a bug manifested with 133 hints, and over the course of 4 hours, I fixed them all individually. This is why people don't mess with branching narratives very often, even though it's something that's unique to video games. It doubles your work. Or in my case, at 1,536 is your work. And when you double your work, you often have the quality. It creates situations where it's almost impossible to find bugs. When I go back and polish up my game that has multiple endings, I will have to do 6 or 8 or 10 times as much work as if I had written a linear visual novel or blockbuster action set piece. But this is exactly why you should make narrative-driven games. When they work, they are just magical. In fact, they're some of my favorite games. Outer Wilds, Obra Dinn, What Remains of Edith Finch, BioShock, Skyrim, Portal, Control, The Stanley Parable, Outer Worlds, Fallout New Vegas, Undertale, the Ace Attorney trilogy, even Hollow Knight, to name a few. Of course, you can pick out flaws in any of those titles, but it's clear that they put at least an equal amount of effort into the story as they did the gameplay. In fact, in video games, it's so easy to pick out the what-ifs, because there are so many possibilities of what a person can do, a player can do, even in my favorite video games. Imagine if, for example, in BioShock, at the big twist halfway through the game, they had actually given you the free will, the ability to make decisions that is at the very heart of what the game is narratively about. My mind would have been blown. I would have never ever forgotten it. But instead, I stopped playing shortly thereafter. And BioShock didn't have branching paths halfway through the game, because it would have doubled the work. It would have doubled the amount of time it took to release the game, it would have doubled the amount of money they had to pay employees, and unfortunately, it wouldn't have increased sales or revenue for that game all that much. If you want to sell games and make money, then you should do what BioShock did. Create a beautiful game, because art and visuals are what sell games. Create incredible, exciting gameplay, and yes, write an amazing story, because BioShock's writing was great. So yes, even if you're looking to make money, if you don't want to make a masterpiece or write a novel, you should make narrative-driven games. You can't advertise your good story like you can visuals, a zesty art style, or a cool gameplay mechanic. But that is exactly why you should focus on your writing. Because visuals, art styles, and mechanics don't end up being as exciting as they look, or they get stale halfway through your 30-hour game, or they get players' expectations too high. And those expectations are great. They can sell the first game in a big way. But if the player gets bored halfway through the game, well, they won't sell your next game. However, if the player gets blindsided by a rich, complex narrative, or a grand mystery, a twist, a cliffhanger, complex characters telling personal stories, or maybe a message about truth, justice, and love in a dark time, well, then the player will certainly be excited about your next game, and your next game, and your next game. We may have to forgo efficiency from time to time to make games that are truly good. On top of never repeat yourself, most coders also hold this quote near and dear: premature optimization is the root of all evil. In context, this quote makes more sense. The real problem is that programmers have spent far too much time worrying about efficiency in the wrong places and at the wrong times. Premature optimization is the root of all evil, or at least most of it, in programming. And so, in the good fight, the fight to make good games, stop worrying so much about efficiency and start focusing on making your game good. You may have to redo it 1,536 times, but it might just be twice as good as anyone else's. And with that foolish bit of naivete, I bid you adieu. And until next time, stay jolly. Hello, everyone, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you are a regular around here, don't worry. Monkey Island Tutorial Part 2 is coming out next week, and this is a new thing for the off weeks for the next few months, maybe, that I'm trying out. If you're new to the channel, I make games, and I make tutorials on how to make narrative-driven games in Unity using a tool called Fungus if you're interested in learning or if you're inspired. Until then, please comment and like and subscribe because I love to hear from you and that helps me out a lot. Until then, stay jolly.